What turns a human mind toward cruelty? So extreme that pain itself becomes a source of fascination. Is this something we are born with? A dark wiring hidden deep inside the brain? Or is it something built slowly over time, through childhood wounds, humiliation, fear, and the quiet growth of violent fantasy? History shows us that some offenders are driven by anger, some by desperation, some by profit. But there exists another, far more disturbing category, the ones who pursue violence not out of rage or necessity, but out of psychological gratification. In the early 20th century, the city of Düsseldorf lived under the shadow of a man whose crimes seemed to follow no ordinary logic. Fear moved quietly through the streets. People walked home faster at night. Windows were locked earlier. Parents warned their children not to wander alone. Some believed the attacker was a monster hiding in the darkness. Others believed he was simply a man. And that question haunted investigators. How could a seemingly ordinary individual carry such disturbing impulses inside his mind? Tonight we examine the psychology behind one of the most unsettling criminal cases in European history, the mind of Peter Kürten. This is not simply a story about crime. It is a story about the slow construction of violent fantasy, the dangerous intersection of trauma and imagination, and the terrifying moment when private thoughts begin crossing into real-world behavior. To understand the psychological structure behind Peter Kürten, investigators and psychologists first look backward, far backward, into the earliest years of his life, because in many extreme offenders, the roots of violent thinkings are rarely found in adulthood alone. Instead, they often grow from environments where instability, fear, or cruelty were present long before the individual fully understood those experiences. Childhood does not automatically create a criminal mind, but it shapes how a person processes emotion, control, and empathy. In Kürten's early environment, reports described a household marked by conflict and harsh discipline. Such conditions can distort a developing sense of safety. When a child grows up surrounded by unpredictability, the brain sometimes learns to interpret the world through a constant lens of tension. For most people, those early pressures lead to anxiety or withdrawal. But in rare cases, they can interact with personality traits that redirect fear into fascination with power. Control becomes attractive because it replaces helplessness. Dominance becomes appealing because it silences the memory of vulnerability. Psychologists studying Kürten later suggested that this shift from vulnerability to the desire for control may have played a critical role in the formation of his fantasies. Fantasies themselves are not unusual. Every human mind explores imagined scenarios. The difference lies in how those fantasies evolve. In healthy development, empathy and social connection shape imagination into cooperative or creative directions. But when empathy becomes weakened or distorted, imagination may wander into darker territory. What begins as curiosity about control can gradually transform into fascination with domination. For Kürten, accounts suggest that imagination and emotional disturbance began intertwining at an early age. Over time, fantasy became a private theater where ideas about power, fear, and sensation could unfold without interruption. And here we encounter an important psychological mechanism: fantasy reinforcement. When a thought produces excitement or emotional stimulation, the brain tends to revisit it. Each repetition strengthens the neural pathway associated with that idea. The thought becomes easier to access. the emotional reaction becomes stronger. Eventually, the fantasy may begin appearing automatically, triggered by situations or memories that resemble its original themes. In individuals with strong empathy, this process usually stops because guilt interrupts the reinforcement cycle. But if empathy is weakened or suppressed, the cycle can continue unchecked. The fantasy grows more detailed, more vivid, and more compelling over time. Investigators later believed that Kürten's imagination gradually built a world in which domination and suffering became psychologically stimulating concepts rather than alarming ones. That transformation does not happen overnight. It develops slowly through repeated internal rehearsal. Every time the fantasy is revisited, the brain becomes slightly more comfortable with it. What once felt shocking begins to feel familiar. What once felt forbidden begins to feel possible. This state, where imagination begins crossing the boundary toward behavior, is one of the most critical points in the psychology of violent offenders. Most people never cross it. Their moral framework, empathy, and social bonds create barriers that prevent fantasy from becoming action. But when those barriers are weakened, curiosity can begin testing reality. The individual may start experimenting with behaviors that echo the internal scenario. At first, these behaviors may seem small or indirect, but each successful step reduces the psychological distance between imagination and action. For someone like Kürten, this gradual erosion of internal resistance created a dangerous trajectory. The mind had spent years exploring themes of power and suffering in secrecy. Once those ideas became deeply embedded, the possibility of acting on them no longer appeared unimaginable. Instead, it appeared intriguing. This is why investigators often describe such offenders as driven, not only by impulse but by compulsion. Shaped through fantasy, the imagination becomes a blueprint. Reality becomes the testing ground. And once that boundary is crossed, the offender may experience a powerful reinforcement effect. The shocking realization that the internal world and the external world can collide. Understanding this process reveals something deeply unsettling about human psychology. The mind can normalize almost anything if it is repeated often, enough in private thought. Kürten's case demonstrates how a combination of childhood instability, emotional disturbance, and unchecked fantasy can gradually construct a worldview where cruelty becomes psychologically meaningful. To the outside world, the transformation remains invisible. Neighbors see an ordinary individual walking through ordinary streets, but inside the mind, an entirely different narrative is unfolding, one that grows darker with every passing year. And as investigators would later discover, once that narrative begins seeking expression in the real world, the consequences can ripple through an entire city. By the time fear truly settled over the streets of Düsseldorf, investigators were facing a question that refused to disappear. What kind of mind could commit acts of violence not in rage, not in desperation, but with something far more disturbing, fascination? The name that would eventually haunt the city belonged to Peter Kürten. But at first, there was no clear identity behind the attacks. There was only a growing pattern of incidents that seemed unpredictable, almost theatrical in their cruelty. For investigators, this unpredictability created a psychological puzzle. Most violent crimes follow some kind of understandable motive: money, revenge, jealousy, personal conflict. Even when the act itself is shocking, the emotional trigger behind it often reveals a clear reason. But in cases driven by sadistic gratification, the motive becomes harder to understand. Because the goal is not practical, it is psychological. The offender is chasing a sensation, and sensations are unpredictable. Psychologists studying violent offenders have long recognized a pattern known as fantasy escalation. When violent thoughts are repeated over time, they rarely remain static. The mind constantly searches for stronger stimulation. What once felt intense begins to feel ordinary. What once satisfied the imagination eventually loses its emotional charge. This forces the fantasy to evolve. The scenario becomes more detailed, more dramatic, more extreme, and eventually, imagination alone may no longer produce the same psychological excitement. At that point, the boundary between fantasy and action becomes dangerously thin. In Kürten's case, analysts believe this process had been developing for years. The private world inside his mind had become a place where suffering, fear, and dominance carried emotional intensity. These ideas were not random. They were carefully reinforced through repetition. Every time the mind revisited those themes, the neural pathways associated with excitement strengthened. Gradually, the fantasy stopped being just a thought. It became an expectation. This is one of the most dangerous stages in the psychology of violent offenders. Once an expectation forms, the brain begins searching for ways to satisfy it. Not necessarily in dramatic leaps, but through gradual testing of reality. A person may begin placing themselves in situations that resemble the internal fantasy, observing reactions, studying vulnerability, imagining how a real-world encounter might unfold. From the outside, these behaviors appear completely ordinary, but internally, the individual may be rehearsing possibilities. Kürten's actions later suggested that he had developed a deep fascination with control over another person's fear. Fear itself became part of the psychological stimulation he sought, and fear is a powerful emotional signal. When one person realizes another is afraid of them, it creates a sudden imbalance of power. For most individuals, that realization triggers empathy or discomfort. The brain recognizes the emotional pain being caused and instinctively pulls back. But in a sadistic personality structure, that signal may produce the opposite reaction. Instead of empathy, it creates excitement. Instead of guilt, it produces curiosity. This reversal is what makes sadistic violence so disturbing. The emotional signals that normally prevent cruelty become the very sensations the offender seeks. Investigators studying Kürten's case later described how this psychological pattern seemed to drive his behavior. The crimes did not always follow the logic of practical benefit. They followed the logic of internal stimulation. In other words, the offender was responding to the emotional feedback generated by his own actions, and that feedback reinforced the behavior. Each act increased the intensity of the experience, strengthening the connection between violence and psychological reward. Over time, the brain begins treating the behavior almost like an addictive stimulus. This is why fantasy-driven violence often escalates. The offender begins searching for stronger experiences to reproduce the emotional effect they previously felt. Smaller acts may no longer satisfy the internal urge. The imagination demands more. But this escalation does not happen in isolation. The offender must still maintain a public identity, a version of themselves that interacts with the outside world normally. This dual existence requires careful control. Conversations must appear natural. Daily routines must continue unchanged. The person must remain socially invisible despite the extreme thoughts driving their private life. For someone like Kürten, This balancing act became part of the psychological structure itself. The normal identity functioned as camouflage. The hidden identity pursued stimulation, and the two worlds rarely collided in public. Neighbors, acquaintances, and strangers could interact with him without realizing that his mind might be interpreting ordinary situations through an entirely different lens. A crowded street might not appear as a place of danger to others, but to someone with violent fantasies, it could become a landscape of possibilities. Who is distracted? Who is isolated? Who appears vulnerable? These questions may pass through the mind without anyone noticing, because from the outside the individual appears calm, composed, and ordinary. This is one of the reasons investigators often struggle. During the early stages of such cases, without a clear motive or recognizable pattern, the crimes appear random. Each incident feels disconnected from the others. But in reality, the pattern exists inside the offender's mind. The pattern follows the emotional logic of the fantasy rather than the practical logic of traditional crime. For Kürten, that internal pattern would eventually become visible only after investigators began connecting behaviors that initially seemed unrelated. When the pieces finally began aligning, the psychological picture that emerged was deeply unsettling. It revealed a mind that had spent years constructing a private world where suffering, fear, and control were not warnings, they were sources of fascination. And once that world began interacting with reality, the consequences spread far beyond the offender himself. Because when a fantasy-driven predator begins acting in the real world, the entire city around them becomes part of the stage. And the most terrifying part of all is this: the people walking those streets rarely realize the danger until it is already too late. As the investigation deepened, something even more disturbing began to emerge about the psychology of Peter Kürten. The violence was not simply an act of impulse or uncontrolled rage. Instead, it appeared tied to a complex internal world, a place where fantasy, sensation, and identity had become tightly intertwined. To understand this pattern, psychologists often focus on a mechanism known as sexualized violence. In most people, emotional and physical sensations are separated by moral boundaries. Pleasure is associated with connection, affection, or intimacy. Pain and fear, on the other hand, trigger empathy and protective instincts. The human brain is wired to react to suffering by trying to stop it. But in rare and deeply disturbed individuals, these emotional circuits can become distorted. Instead of separating pleasure from suffering, the brain begins linking them together. When that happens, the individual may start experiencing excitement not from intimacy or connection, but from power and domination. The emotional signals that normally discourage cruelty become associated with stimulation. This psychological crossover is what investigators believe occurred in Kürten's mind. Over time, the fantasies he rehearsed privately began merging two powerful emotional forces: fear and excitement. Each time the mind replayed those scenarios, the emotional connection grew stronger. Eventually, the fantasy itself became a source of anticipation. The individual begins thinking about it repeatedly, refining the scenario, imagining new variations. This process can continue for years before any real-world action occurs. But every repetition strengthens the mental pathway. And once the connection becomes strong enough, the fantasy starts demanding expression. For someone like Kürten, this meant that the act itself was not only about control. It was about recreating the emotional intensity that his imagination had already built inside his mind. That intensity became addictive. Psychologists sometimes describe this pattern as compulsive reenactment. The offender seeks to recreate a particular emotional state again and again, chasing the same psychological sensation that the fantasy once produced. But real life rarely matches imagination perfectly. So each attempt becomes a form of experimentation. The offender may adjust behavior, searching for ways to intensify the experience. This is why escalation becomes so common in fantasy-driven crimes. The individual is not satisfied with repetition alone. They want to reproduce the emotional peak they remember from earlier fantasies, and that pursuit can push behavior toward increasingly dangerous territory. Another disturbing feature of Kürten's psychology was the level of emotional detachment that appeared during these acts. Emotional detachment does not mean the person feels nothing. In fact, the opposite can be true. The offender may feel intense excitement, but empathy, the ability to recognize and respond to another person's suffering, becomes suppressed or absent. Victims stop being perceived as individuals with their own lives and emotions. Instead, they become instruments inside the offender's psychological experience. This dehumanization is one of the most critical elements in violent crime psychology. Without it, the emotional resistance would be too strong. The brain would recognize the victim's fear and immediately generate guilt or hesitation. But when the victim is mentally reduced to an object, a symbol within the fantasy, those protective emotional signals disappear. The offender is no longer interacting with a person. They are interacting with an idea, and ideas are easier to manipulate. Investigators studying Kürten's case later noted how carefully he seemed to maintain his ordinary identity outside of those moments. This dual structure, normal life on the surface, disturbing impulses underneath, allowed him to move through society without immediate suspicion. This duality is not uncommon among organized offenders. The public self remains calm and socially functional. The private self pursues stimulation through secrecy. Maintaining this separation requires a surprising amount of psychological discipline. The offender must constantly monitor how they appear to others. They must keep conversations normal, routines consistent, and behavior predictable. Any sudden change could attract attention. But over time, maintaining this double life can also produce a sense of superiority. The offender begins believing they are smarter than everyone around them. Each day they remain undetected reinforces that belief. Every ordinary interaction becomes proof that the disguise is working. That belief in intellectual superiority is dangerous, because once someone becomes convinced that they cannot be caught, their caution begins to weaken. The behavior may grow bolder, the risks may increase, and eventually the hidden pattern becomes too large to remain invisible. For Kürten, this moment would eventually arrive when investigators started noticing connections between incidents that had initially appeared unrelated. The crimes were no longer isolated events. They began forming a psychological map, a pattern of behavior driven by the same internal forces. When investigators finally understood that pattern, the picture became terrifyingly clear. They were not searching for someone motivated by money or revenge. They were searching for someone chasing a psychological experience. A person who had spent years building a private world where violence carried emotional meaning. And once that world began colliding with reality, the city itself became part of the stage where the fantasy played out. But perhaps the most chilling lesson from Kürten's story is not simply the violence itself. It is the realization that the human mind is capable of constructing such elaborate, internal narratives without anyone around them noticing. A person may walk through crowded streets, speak calmly with neighbors, and follow ordinary routines, while inside their thoughts a completely different reality is unfolding. And sometimes that hidden reality grows strong enough to break into the world around it. By the time investigators began fully understanding the psychology behind the crimes connected to Peter Kürten, the case had already revealed something deeply unsettling about the human mind. It was not simply the violence itself that disturbed experts studying the pattern. It was the realization that the offender appeared to derive emotional stimulation from the very act that most people instinctively recoil from. To most individuals, suffering triggers an immediate emotional response: discomfort, empathy, the urge to help or intervene. These reactions are built into the brain's social wiring. They help societies function, allowing people to care for one another and recognize when harm is being done. But in rare cases, that wiring behaves differently. Instead of producing empathy, the brain associates suffering with stimulation. Instead of moral resistance, it generates curiosity or fascination. For someone with this psychological distortion, the signals that normally prevent cruelty become twisted into sources of emotional intensity. Psychologists refer to this pattern as sadistic reinforcement. In such cases, the individual experiences a strong emotional response during acts of domination or cruelty. That emotional response becomes the reward, and like any reward, it strengthens the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated. The brain begins learning the pattern. Action leads to stimulation. Stimulation leads to repetition. Over time, the offender may begin actively seeking situations where that emotional reaction can occur again. In Kürten's case, investigators and psychologists later concluded that this cycle of reinforcement had likely been developing long before the crimes themselves became visible. His fantasies, rehearsed repeatedly in private, had already built a psychological structure where power and fear were emotionally stimulating concepts. Once those ideas crossed into reality, the reinforcement effect became even stronger. Real-world experience carries a far more powerful emotional charge than imagination alone. The brain processes it as a direct reward. That reward strengthens the neural pathways associated with the behavior, and the cycle deepens. What makes this pattern particularly disturbing is how quickly the brain can adapt to it. Human psychology is remarkably flexible. When a behavior produces a strong emotional response, the mind begins integrating it into the individual's identity. Instead of seeing the act as something separate from themselves, the offender may begin viewing it as an essential part of who they are. This transformation creates a powerful internal narrative. The offender no longer believes they are simply committing an act. They believe they're fulfilling something within themselves, a desire, an urge, a compulsion that feels inseparable from their personality. For someone like Kürten, this narrative likely reinforced the behavior over time. The more the acts produced emotional stimulation, the more they became psychologically meaningful. But there is another dimension to this psychology that investigators often emphasize: compartmentalization. Compartmentalization allows an individual to maintain two separate versions of themselves. One version interacts with the outside world, polite, calm, socially functional. The other version exists internally, driven by impulses that the public identity carefully conceals. Maintaining this division requires constant mental discipline. The offender must ensure that the internal identity never leaks into everyday behavior. Conversations must remain normal. Routines must remain predictable. Emotions must appear appropriate to the situation. For observers, this creates a powerful illusion. They see only the public identity. They never see the hidden one. In many notorious cases, acquaintances later express shock after learning the truth about someone they thought they understood. They describe the person as quiet, ordinary, or even friendly. This reaction does not necessarily mean those observers were naive. It reflects the effectiveness of compartmentalization. The human brain is capable of separating behaviors in ways that allow extreme contradictions to coexist. A person may appear calm in daily life, while privately nurturing impulses that never surface in public. Kürten's Caius illustrates how dangerous that psychological division can become when violent fantasies receive repeated reinforcement. Once the internal identity grows strong enough, the offender may begin seeing their hidden actions not as deviations from normal life, but as the true expression of themselves. The public identity becomes the disguise. The private impulses become the reality. And when that shift occurs, the individual may start taking greater risks. Caution fades. Confidence grows. Each successful act strengthens the belief that they can continue without consequences. Eventually, patterns begin emerging. Investigators notice connections between incidents. Witness accounts overlap. Small details accumulate into a larger picture. The invisible structure inside the offender's mind begins revealing itself through repeated behavior. When that happens, the investigation transforms from confusion into clarity. The crimes no longer appear random. They reveal the psychological signature of the person behind them. In the case of Peter Kürten, that signature exposed a mind shaped by fantasy escalation, emotional distortion, and a deeply disturbing connection between violence and stimulation. His story remains one of the most chilling examples of how the human imagination, when untethered from empathy, can construct a reality where cruelty becomes meaningful. But studying cases like this serves a purpose beyond fascination. They remind us that violent behavior rarely appears suddenly or without psychological roots. It develops through complex interactions between personality, environment, fantasy, and reinforcement. Understanding those processes does not excuse the crimes, but it helps investigators, psychologists, and society recognize the warning signs that may appear long before violence reaches its most extreme form. And perhaps the most unsettling realization from Kürten's case is this: the human mind is powerful enough to create entire worlds inside itself. Worlds where the rules of empathy no longer apply. Worlds where domination replaces connection. Worlds where the suffering of others becomes part of the narrative the individual tells themselves. Most minds reject those worlds immediately, but a few step inside them. And once someone begins living in that internal reality, the line between imagination and action can slowly begin to disappear.